Chapter 4. The Man with White Hair. Nick stopped his car in front of the hotel. He looked carefully before he got out, but there was nobody with white hair near the hotel. He half ran through the hotel doors and went to the desk inside. "I'm looking for a man with very short white hair," he said to the woman behind the desk. "He's staying here, I think. He's about 60 years old, and he's tall and thin." The woman did not look very interested. "There are a lot of visitors in the hotel," she said. "Do you know his name?" "No, I don't," Nick said. "He's, a friend of a friend, you see. He arrived in Vancouver yesterday, and I must find him. It's very important. Please help me." The woman looked at him. "There are 350 rooms in this hotel," she said, "and maybe 30 or 40 men with white hair. How can I remember all their names?" She turned away to answer a telephone call. Nick walked away from the desk. "A drink," he thought. "I need a drink." He went into the hotel bar, got a drink, and sat down at a table. "So, what do I do now?" he thought. And then he remembered something. A letter in the girl's half-open bag in the Whistler Cafe. "And we can meet at the Empress Hotel, Victoria, Vancouver Island, on Friday afternoon." And tomorrow was Friday. "I'm going to Victoria, on Vancouver Island," he thought. "To the Empress Hotel." Nick had dinner in the hotel that evening. He finished eating and got up from his table and saw the man with white hair. Nick moved quickly. The man was at the hotel desk. Nick could see the white head above the other heads near the desk. "Excuse me," said Nick. He pushed past the people in the hotel restaurant. A small boy ran in front of him, and Nick ran into him. The boy and Nick fell down on the floor. The boy began to cry. "Hey!" said a woman behind Nick. "I'm very sorry," said Nick. He got up and helped the boy to his feet. "Are you okay?" he asked the boy. "Be more careful next time," said the woman. Nick moved away quickly, but when he looked back at the hotel desk, he couldn't see the man with white hair. He pushed through the crowd of people. "That man!" he shouted at the woman behind the desk. "That man with short white hair! Where did he go?" The woman looked at Nick. "Mr. Vickers," she said. "I don't know." "Vickers? Is that his name?" said Nick. "What's his room number?" "I'm sorry, I can't tell you that," the woman said. "But I need to," began Nick. The woman turned away to answer the telephone. After a second or two, Nick went upstairs to his room. Vickers, he thought. Does Meg Hudson know Mr. Vickers? I need some answers, and I need them quickly. Chapter 5. Vancouver Island. Tawasin was about 23 miles south of Vancouver. Nick drove there in his car the next morning for the 1 o'clock ferry to Vancouver Island. Every 5 minutes, he looked behind him. The road was busy. Black cars, white cars, red cars, green cars. Maybe Vickers was in one of them. At Tawasin, Nick drove his car onto the ferry. There were a lot of cars and crowds of people. Nick got out of his car and walked up and down the ship. He looked for a man with white hair, but he didn't see one. Soon the ferry began to move, and Nick felt better. He found the ferry restaurant and got something to eat. More people came in. Nick looked at the faces of all the older men. Some had hats on, so he looked for somebody tall and thin. But there was nobody. Maybe he's not on the ferry, Nick thought. Maybe he's back in Vancouver. Later, Nick walked around the ship again. Once, he thought he saw the man with white hair in the crowds, but he could not be sure. 90 minutes after leaving Tawasin, the ferry arrived at Swartz Bay on Vancouver Island, and Nick went back down to his car. Swartz Bay was 20 miles north of Victoria. Nick drove quickly, and again looked behind him every 4 or 5 minutes. Once, he saw a red car about 200 yards behind him. Did I see that car on the road from Vancouver to Tawasin? He thought. He drove more slowly, but the red car still stayed 200 yards behind him, and Nick couldn't see the driver's face or hair. Soon he was in the busy streets of Victoria, and Nick didn't see the red car behind him again. Victoria was a city of gardens and beautiful old buildings. Nick liked Victoria very much, but today he wasn't interested in gardens or buildings. He found the Empress Hotel, went inside, and walked across to the desk. "Can I help you?" a young man asked Nick. "I'm meeting a friend here this afternoon," said Nick. "Miss Hudson." "Hudson," said the young man. "Wait a minute." He went away and came back. "Sorry, but there's no Miss Hudson staying here." Nick took something from his pocket. It was the photograph of Meg and her father, from the magazine. "This is her," he said. The young man looked at the picture. "Oh, right! You mean Howard Hudson's daughter," he said. "She's not staying here, but I saw her 10 or 15 minutes ago. She was with somebody, a man. He asked me about the tea room." "The tea room," said Nick. "Where's that?" The man with short, white hair was tired. He couldn't sleep, and he couldn't eat. He thought about only one thing all the time. He drove and he watched, and he waited and he followed. When he drove into Victoria, the streets were busy, and suddenly he lost the blue car in front of him. Angrily, he drove around the city, past all the big hotels. "I must find him," he said. "I must do it. Today." Then he saw the Empress Hotel, and in the street outside it, a blue car. He drove past the hotel, left his car, and ran back down the street. He went across the road and walked past the downstairs windows. There was a big room with tables and chairs and a lot of people. He looked carefully at all the faces. "There she is," he said suddenly. There were two men with the girl. He couldn't see their faces, only the backs of their heads, but one of the men was in a green shirt. "Mr. Hollywood," the man said, and smiled. "Goodbye, Mr. Hollywood." People in the street turned to look at him, but the man did not see them. He walked up to the doors of the hotel and put a hand into his pocket. Inside, the gun was cold and hard. Chapter 6. A Tea Party. Nick looked through the doors of the tea room in the Empress Hotel. Meg Hudson sat at a table with a man. The man was about 30, or maybe a year or two younger. He was tall and brown from the sun. He wore a white shirt, white trousers, and white shoes. He said something to Meg, and she laughed. She looked very happy. A waiter came up to Nick. "Can I get you some tea?" he asked. "No, thanks," said Nick. "I'm with the two people over there." And he walked across to Meg's table. "Hello, mystery girl," said Nick. "Remember me? We met at Whistler. Your name was Jan then, but maybe today it's Meg Hudson." Meg Hudson looked up at him. "Oh!" she said, and her face went red. "Who is this, Meg?" asked the man. "This is Nick," said Meg. "He's a writer. Nick, this is Craig Winters." "Sometimes called Mr. Hollywood?" said Nick. Maybe. But how did you know that? Asked Craig Winters. I guessed, said Nick. And I think I'm beginning to understand. Can I ask you a question, Mr. Winters? Does somebody want to kill you? Craig Winters' face went white. Kill me? What are you talking about? Asked Meg. Before I tell you, answer this question, please, said Nick. You called me Mr. Hollywood in Whistler, and you wanted the man at the next table, the man with white hair, to hear you. Is that right? Meg Hudson did not answer at first. Then she said quietly, Yes. Why? Asked Nick. I wanted him to follow you, and not me. Why? Nick asked again. I think he's a detective, said Meg. And I think he's working for my father. I saw him soon after I left Toronto. He followed me. Meg put her hand on Craig Winters' arm. My father doesn't like Craig. A month ago, he told me not to see Craig again. I'm not happy, and he knows that. I think he guessed that I'm meeting Craig. And now he wants to find Craig and stop him seeing me. Stop him, said Nick. Or kill him. No, Meg Hudson said. Daddy doesn't. The man with white hair pushed me in front of a car in Vancouver, Nick told her. And he shot at me in Stanley Park. What? Said Meg. Tell me about this man with white hair, Winters said suddenly. Nick looked at him. He's about 60, and he's tall and thin, he said. Do you know his name? Asked Winters. Vickers, said Nick. Craig Winters suddenly looked ill. Did he follow you to Victoria? Did he follow you here? I don't know, said Nick. He watched Winters. You're afraid of him. Why? Why does this man Vickers want to kill you, Winters? Before Craig Winters could answer, Meg's face went white. Oh, no, she said. Look! Look over there! By the door! Nick and Craig Winters turned to look. At the door of the tea room stood the man with white hair. He looked up and down the room, and then he saw them and began to walk across to their table. His hand was in his pocket. For a second or two, the three people at the table did not move. Then Craig Winters jumped to his feet. That's Mr. Hollywood, he screamed. That man there! And he pointed at Nick. The man's hand came out of his pocket with a gun. This is for Anna! He shouted. Nick moved very fast. the tea table went over, and Nick was down on the floor in a second. The shot went over his head, and Meg screamed. At the same time, Craig Winters shouted out and put a hand on his arm. There was blood on his white shirt. Then more people began to scream, and 2 waiters pulled the man with white hair down onto the floor. "Get the police!" somebody shouted.